Live Alive. Apparently this is getting a remake? Neat. Hopefully it's not as bad as every other Square Enix remake post-DS Chrono Trigger. But it probably will be. And because I have zero impulse control because neurodivergence, I'm probably gonna spend all the money on the world on it, even though I know I'm gonna hate it. But if you've been living under a rock for the past year, I spent the past year streaming this game, and it's a lot of fun. This is probably my favorite import RPG on the Super Nintendo that we never got. No disrespect for Terranigma. I know a lot of people really like that game, but as a massive fan blinded by nostalgia for Illusion of Gaia, I tend to prefer that game over Terranigma. But Live Alive is a very, very interesting and unique game, and since I have the footage having played through it over the past year, and you should go watch those videos, you know, I figured it would be timely for me to talk about this, you know, in light of the fact that this is going to be remade and that I have all this footage. Now, if I were to try and summarize Live Alive in the most succinct way possible, it would be that it's basically SaGa if SaGa was good. And I don't mean that to disrespect SaGa, but as someone who tried to play Romancing Saga before and after several hours still couldn't find the first fight, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of SaGa, honestly. I mean, I bought Romancing Saga just because it had a Secret of Mana cameo, more than because I actually wanted to play SaGa Frontier. And the less I talk about Unlimited Saga, the happier I'll be. Now, for those uninitiated with SaGa, that's typically an RPG series that follows multiple characters in each game, all taking place in a singular connected world, but all telling different stories, and all showing characters that have their own different lives. And Live Alive is very similar to that, except that every character takes place in a different thematic and gameplay genre. Don't get me wrong, they're all RPGs and they all use the same base mechanics, but they try and sort of adopt other mechanics based on different environments and different gameplay genres, whereas every story takes place in sort of a different thematic world. The game follows 7 main characters, well, sort of, each taking place in its own sort of unique, condensed, contained world that almost plays like its own unique game. You have a ninja that plays like a stealth game, a cowboy that sort of plays like a time management strategy game. You have a sort of Tamagotchi raising simulator in the Kung Fu chapter, a survival horror space chapter, a caveman themed RPG that doesn't use any dialogue whatsoever. Well, there's one word that's used in the entire chapter, and it's literally the last part of the game. The modern day chapter plays more like a fighting game than anything, complete with Street Fighter-esque enemy selections and victory and loss screens, which is awesome. And finally, you have the near future chapter, which is like the one really unbelievably bad thing about this game, and it's basically Diet Akira, which is probably why the main character is named Akira. Just throwing that out there. Every character has their own self-contained story and world, and no chapter is terribly big. You could probably clear every chapter in about an hour, maybe 2, depending on how thorough you want to be, and finding all the secrets because there's a lot of them, and they exist as basically a series of self-contained stories that seem completely unrelated to one another. Until you finish all of them, and spoilers for the next little bit, but you unlock one final chapter that allows you to play an RPG, like a proper RPG with random encounters which are otherwise absent from the game, which features a knight who is basically the ordained hero of the world whose life is going perfect, except until it doesn't, and then it kind of goes really unbelievably bad. All it takes is one really bad day to make the hero into a villain. Yeah, this game takes that to its extreme. And then finally, you unlock one final chapter that interconnects all the characters to stop that threat. But every chapter of this game has its own self-contained story, and they are all, with the exception of the near future chapter, really well told, all while giving you different mechanics, characters, and experiences. It's basically like getting 8 different games all crammed into one, but they're all their own unique thing, and they really work really well together despite the fact that they are so completely different. They surprisingly meld really well together. Like I said, every chapter to Live Alive plays a little bit differently, but they do have similarities to their core gameplay. It's a top-down RPG where you wander around, usually interacting with environments, and barring the last 2 chapters of the game, there's no random encounters. Every encounter is something that either happens because of plot, or because of a character that you see and interact with in the environment itself. Once you get into combat, you are put on a chessboard, and while this game doesn't initially really explain this to you in any way, because there is no tutorial, because you can just do whatever chapter you want in whatever order you want, the combat is a little bit less directly easy to understand than it initially appears. Because this might look kind of real time, but it's really not. It is very much a turn-based RPG, even if it doesn't really overtly say this. Enemies will attack after you attack, they'll move after you move. If their speed trumps yours, then they have the initiative on you. And that's the basest of it. That said, there are some unique mechanics combat-wise to each chapter, because each character plays very differently. If you're the kind of person who enjoys building your character and customizing them, that's not really here. Your character's individual roles are more or less decided from the start, and the only real differences between them are what you equip them with and what sort of stats those equipments bestow upon you. Because some of your attacks are reliant on certain stats more than others, you might want to invest in equipment that gives you specific stat boosts over others, but typically it's a fairly linear equipment base, and your characters are going to be exactly what the developers intended with very little variance between them. However, because each character is sort of married to their role in the world, they do have each their own specific uses, which makes them very, very interesting. For example, in the ninja chapter, by playing the ninja, you are ostensibly an attacker. You're an all-roundy character, but a lot of your abilities are based on your ninjutsu, which is based on modifying your environments, putting down fire tiles to damage enemies over time, which can be useful because that chapter features enemies that otherwise can't be killed, but if they take a little bit of damage from the environment, then suddenly they instantly die. Likewise, characters such as knockoff Akira, their combat is based around, because they're in the future, fighting remote enemies. And these remote enemies can drop robot parts that you can use to upgrade your turtle robot, don't ask, and you could take the time to take out those enemies, but because they are so frustrating to take out, it's easier to just take out their commander with their controller, and then suddenly they all die. It plays almost like a sort of strategy game where there's only one target you need to hit, and it's really about placing your character in the right situation in order to hit them. And indeed, environmental control and figuring out the proper attack ranges is really the key to playing this game right. Outside of combat, each character's chapter does play fairly unique. Sometimes with the characters gaining an extra ability mapped to the Y button to better infiltrate their environment and advance the plot as necessary. For example, the ninja's chapter is all about infiltrating this castle. He then has a couple extra mechanics of keeping a kill count, where ideally you either go for no kills or a perfect kill streak in order to get the maximum reward. No kills gets you the best weapon in the chapter, except that there's a secret boss that gives you another one that's equally strong, or you can get all kills and get the most experience ever and take on those secret bosses. The choice is yours, but there are a few other extra perks to it. But while you infiltrate this, you also have an invisibility cloak mapped to the Y button, which allows you to avoid enemies. However, the enemy's AI for actual pathing tends to make them smush into you even if you're invisible, so sometimes it still feels like combat's inevitable unless you spam saves a lot. Diet Akira has the magical power of being lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of invisible flags. Seriously, it's invisible plot flag the chapter. Okay, well, actually, his main ability is the fact that he's a psychic, so he can stand next to people, read their minds, and advance the plot that way, but his chapter just sucks, and it's really the one really objectively bad thing about this game. But lots of things in his chapter are just talk to this random character that won't say anything relevant to the plot in order to make something happen somewhere else. At one point, you have to go into the toilet and sit on the toilet 3 times in a row to talk to another NPC in order to move the plot forward. His chapter needs a total overhaul for this remake, I'm just saying. Seriously, don't play this chapter first, maybe play it after the most interesting chapter after this one, and then you'll at least get the worst part of this game out of the way. Seriously, I love this game. This chapter is a huge waste of time, and it's one of the longest ones. Also, he has an overworld map that kind of plays a little bit like Heyanko Alien, and that's me once again flexing my completely obscure game muscles. Awesome. The Kung Fu chapter, like I said, is kind of a Tamagotchi style game. You have to raise a protege for your Kung Fu style, and unlike every other chapter where you can name your character, instead you get to name your Kung Fu style. Unfortunately, there was not enough spaces to name my Kung Fu style Jackie Chan's action Kung Fu, but there was enough for ER Kung Fu, so it kind of worked out, I guess. But the thing is, you have 3 different proteges, and you have to train them up to ultimately master your moves. The more of a specific move you use on them, the more they'll learn it. And each of these proteges has a completely different stat profile. You could pick Lee Kugo, my go-to character from this chapter. She's awesome. She's also the only girl protagonist in this game. She's incredibly good, she's fast, she's a great all-rounder, and she can learn a lot of abilities. Or you could pick Samo, who tends to be a heavier hitter, despite the fact the game says he's really fast, he really isn't, except because he's a higher level than the other 2 characters, he learns less abilities as time goes on. There's also Yun, who I think is supposed to be like the canonical protege for this chapter. He has the greatest potential to learn the most, but his stats are lower than the other 2 because of it. And spoilers a little bit for the next like 10 seconds, but you need to focus on one protege because the other 2 are kind of there as red herrings. You can pick which one you want, but pick one and don't invest in the other 2. At all. The Old West chapter is all about trying to stop this gang from completely destroying this town and also killing you, and it's basically about getting random crap and assigning villagers to try and set up traps Home Alone style to take out a gang, because by the end of this chapter, if you do nothing, you're going to be fighting the boss with yourself and your sort of rival guy against like the boss plus 30 dudes, or you could just be fighting 2-on-1 the boss. But that might not be the way you want to go about things, because then you're playing suboptimally and not getting some of the accessories for that chapter because you've used them to set up traps. The space chapter is all about wandering around this space station as this weird sort of horror manifests, and you have to run away because you can't fight, because this is a chapter with no combat except for the final boss and like this weird arcade game you can just play for reasons. It's a very neat chapter, I will say that. It's definitely cliche, you kind of know where it's gone if you've seen any sort of sci-fi space horror ever, but it's still a really cool, well-paced chapter, and for a chapter with basically 0 combat, it's still ridiculously engaging, although there is a lot of instant death, so save a lot during this chapter is what I'm saying. In the prehistoric chapter, you can't see any of the enemies on screen, they're invisible, so you have to use your smell ability to detect where they are using the Y button. But otherwise, it's a fairly straightforward RPG. The present chapter, while it is still a turn-based RPG, plays more and more like a fighting game. You have to quickly figure out what your opponent's going to do and take them out, but at the same time, your character is learning all of his opponent's special abilities. So, sort of like an inverse of the Kung Fu chapter, now you have to be targeted by your opponent's special attacks, or else you will be lacking later on. And of course, the final 2 chapters take place on the same map but slightly differently, and these are straight up RPGs with invisible encounters as well as just building levels. The final iteration of this chapter, of course, also contains something for all of the characters that come together at the end. A special final dungeon for each character, some better than others, because while I do like the puzzles of the intelligence dungeon, I really, really hate the key spam of the key dungeon, which is just it's a dungeon where you have to sit around waiting for random encounters to drop random drops that will hopefully open doors, but they're one use, so you have to grind them. It's not a well-made, like, sub-dungeon. Fortunately, you can kind of skip them. It's just your best equipment. It's not necessary, but it's still cool to do all this stuff. And in a similar vein, every single chapter has a ton of secret stuff in it. The prehistoric caveman chapter has like 3 of the best accessories in the game, and the ninja chapter has like 2 secret bosses, some incredible equipment depending on how you play. However, this does lead to one real problem with that chapter, and that is if you want to play optimally and get like all the best equipment, fight all the bosses and stuff, you have to play in a wildly convoluted and complicated way. And like, literally, I'm not even joking here, one wrong step in the ninja chapter can lead you from getting all the best stuff in that chapter to basically getting none of it. Yeah, the ninja chapter is unbelievably convoluted if you want to play it well, especially if you want all the fun little secrets and goodies and stuff. But my point is that every chapter plays differently, and there's tons to see, even though these are fairly small, self-contained sort of mini RPG adventures with their different takes on every single genre. And that's awesome. Sure, they're not perfect, but the fact that the game is willing to try all these different ideas and sort of meld them together in the vein of an RPG, sort of, and the fact that it works as well as it does, it's nothing short of a miracle, and yet it works very, very well, barring the future knockoff Akira chapter, which, again, just needs to be completely rewritten and probably restructured entirely. Overall, Live Alive has a lot of content, and if you feel like you've done one of these chapters wrong, at least before you get to like an end game point of no return, you can go back and retry those chapters and try again and try better if you want to see a different route or you're not happy with the outcome. Not to say that the stories change any, but you can at least explore all the secrets and stuff a little bit better. That said, some of the stuff, it does behoove you to play with a guide. The entire near future Akira chapter, you're gonna need a guide for because it's far too complicated not to play without a guide. And the ninja chapter, if you want to play well, you basically need a guide as well because it is wildly unforgiving about it. But there's a ton of gameplay here, there's a ton of secrets, and it's just because of all this and because of how interesting and different every chapter is, I think this is a game that is just filled with replayability, as well as a little bit of something for everyone. In terms of presentation, Live Alive is just sort of alright. Visually, this game still exists in the Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy V style of our characters still are only one tile big, so there's only so much detail and, character we can really cram in there. But they still like to throw in a lot of exaggerated sort of emotions and faces in there to try and make it filled with a little bit more character, and that's definitely appreciated. In combat, the character sprites are amazing though, especially the really, really big enemies and the bosses. So while on the overworld it's very, very simplified, I think it does lend itself to a nice clean look, if nothing else. And in combat, you can see them really go crazy with the sprite art, leading to kind of a mixed bag, but I still think it looks pretty good. Audio-wise, the soundtrack is okay. The final boss theme for every chapter, Megalomania, is unbelievably good, and the other soundtracks are quite good as well. I'm quite partial to the theme song to the Kung Fu chapter. I've used it in a few videos actually. The soundtrack isn't necessarily the best out there, especially for the time, but it's still decent enough. Now, if you want a copy of Live Alive on the Super Famicom, the nice thing is there is a translation for this by good old Eon Genesis, one of the better translation groups out there in my opinion. And since I bought my repro, they've actually updated it. So I had to use the update for my Let's Play, and it was good before, it's significantly better now. And of course, there is a new version coming out, which will probably be, more official, although better is not necessarily going to be the case. The Super Famicom version, cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now, is $45. But of course, if you can't understand Japanese and need a translation for this, you're probably going to have to go with a repro on this one. So, reproduction costs and stuff. Still, it's definitely worth it. This was my first reproduction I got. It was my first import I ever got translated, and it's still very special. I still think this is one of the coolest RPGs on the system, and I've played the big five. Terranigma, Bahamut Lagoon, Treasure of Redra, Live Alive, Seiken Densetsu 3. I think this one is probably the most interesting out of the lot. Maybe not the highest quality, but I still think this is probably the one I'd go to more and more. Sure, there are frustrating bits. The ninja chapter is very, very fiddly if you want to play it well, and seriously, that knockoff Akira chapter is just the worst thing ever, but it's still a very, very interesting game, and I think one of the more noteworthy games we never got. I know a lot of people will go to Seiken Densetsu 3, I know a lot of people will go to Terranigma, but I think Live Alive to me is probably the most interesting import we never got, in terms of RPGs anyway. And it's getting a remake! And it's getting a new visual style, which honestly, I don't know, I kind of like the original visual style, and it's a remake by Square Enix. Oh god, it's gonna be awful, isn't it? Square Enix, can you just stop making bad, cheap cash-ins on remaking things I like. Please. Seriously, please. Wasn't ActRaiser and Secret of Mana enough? You've already destroyed so many important things to me. Please just don't completely cock this up. I'm begging you.